What if the most dangerous leaders aren't the ones who lie to manipulate the masses, but the ones who lie so well to themselves that they can't even see the wreckage they're causing? Not because they're hiding evil in their hearts, but because they genuinely believe their hand is guided by something noble. Imagine someone in power making ruinous decisions while convinced that they are protecting the world from chaos. The danger doesn't lie in their deceit. It lies in their sincerity. They aren't twisting the truth on purpose. They've lost the ability to tell what truth even looks like. Think of a ruler raised up by the cheers of a hopeful nation, a person who enters office speaking of reform, of justice, of making things better for everyone. At first, their promises feel real. They reduce taxes. They give voice to the common citizen. They elevate art, music, and poetry. They seem to be the answer to years of turmoil. But beneath that golden exterior, something begins to crack, something subtle and slow, like a foundation shifting just enough to send fractures through every stone. Before long, they've turned on those closest to them, betrayed the very ideals they once championed, and destroyed the very city they claimed to love. This isn't fiction. It's a pattern older than memory. Look at Emperor Nero. Early in his reign, he was adored, a beacon of culture, a man who respected artists and listened to the people. But within a few short years, that admiration curdled. He murdered his mother, brutally ended the life of his wife, and played music as flames consumed Rome. Historians didn't describe him as a villain with a plan, but as a man so certain of his own divinity that anyone who disagreed became an enemy of beauty, an enemy of destiny. This self-deception isn't exclusive to kings or emperors. It lives in boardrooms and government offices, in billionaires' compounds and private jets. Take the story of Howard Hughes, a genius in his early years. He revolutionized aviation, changed the landscape of American cinema, and built an empire that touched everything from healthcare to energy. But over time, his mind turned inward. He locked himself away, terrified of germs, convinced that invisible enemies surrounded him. His descent into paranoia didn't just ruin his own life. It left an empire in disarray, thousands without direction, investors grasping at silence, and workers uncertain of their future. When a powerful mind begins to break away from reality, the damage is never contained. And the terrifying truth is that it doesn't always look like madness. It often masquerades as conviction, as confidence, as certainty. Research in social psychology confirms what history has shown us time and again. The more power people gain, the more they believe in their own brilliance. They stop recognizing their own limitations. They no longer doubt themselves because they've built a world where no one else is allowed to. Half a millennium ago, an Italian diplomat observed these dangerous shifts with uncanny precision. Niccolo Machiavelli didn't sit in an ivory tower spinning theories. He stood among the chaos, watching leaders rise and fall. When he wrote about the brutal mechanics of leadership, he wasn't creating a blueprint for tyranny. He was chronicling a disease that infects the mind through the corridors of power. He saw that power warps perception. The higher someone climbs, the fewer people truly see them. Most only catch a glimpse of the mask, confident, composed, capable. Very few witness the raw human underneath, the fears, the doubts, the moments of uncertainty. That's not just reputation management. It's the first step in a mental shift where performance replaces truth. People encounter authority figures in carefully curated moments, when they speak from stages, when they deliver announcements, when they appear to make bold decisions. Rarely do they see hesitation, confusion, or second-guessing. That filtered reality creates a mirror that only reflects power back to itself. The leader begins to believe the image more than the human behind it. Machiavelli saw something darker still. He understood that people in high positions don't just fool others, They become the most loyal believers of their own illusions. The people around them, staff, advisors, supporters, media, have every reason to echo the message. Their own fortunes are tied to the leader's success. So they stop offering hard truths. They start nodding a little more quickly, smiling a little more often, telling the leader what they want to hear. Not always out of fear, but out of self-interest. And so begins a feedback loop, a system that rewards delusion and punishes clarity. A leader says something outlandish, and instead of being challenged, they're met with applause. They propose a reckless plan, and instead of hearing warning bells, they're flooded with enthusiasm. Over time, it's no longer manipulation. It's not a game. The leader genuinely believes they're on the right path, because the world they've built constantly reinforces that belief. There's a modern term for this: motivated reasoning. When a person begins with a conclusion and then gathers only the evidence that supports it. And when you have enough influence, that process becomes industrial. You don't just consult experts, you fund them. You don't just read media, you shape it. You don't just seek opinions, you manufacture consensus. This isn't a conspiracy, it's a psychological mechanism. From the inside, it feels like integrity. You're not ignoring critics, you're being solution-focused. You're not silencing dissent, you're protecting morale. It's all rational until the moment reality finally breaks through, and by then, it's often too late. Neuroscientific research reveals an even more unsettling truth. Power alters the brain. The very circuits that govern empathy, self-awareness, and social understanding begin to quiet down. The longer someone holds authority, the harder it becomes for them to recognize the feelings and thoughts of others. Not because they've turned cruel, but because the architecture of compassion starts to erode. This is how fraud becomes innovation in the eyes of those wielding power. It's how corporate crime gets repackaged as visionary strategy. It's not always deception. More often, it's a sincere inability to see the cracks forming beneath your feet. When executives at Enron cooked their books, they weren't just fooling investors. They had spent so many years being praised, celebrated, and admired that they no longer doubted their own righteousness. Criticism became sabotage. Honest questions became attacks, and the empire collapsed under the weight of its own illusions. Machiavelli once wrote that the surest way to understand a ruler's mind is to look at those they choose to surround themselves with. He wasn't making a political recommendation. He was diagnosing a cognitive disease. Strong leaders bring in voices that challenge them, that point out their blind spots, that keep their thinking sharp. Leaders in decline build echo chambers. But the worst part is, this shift doesn't happen with malice. It happens with comfort. It feels like relief. Surrounding yourself with agreeable people seems wise, even strategic. After all, who wants to constantly fight over every decision? Who wants to be told they're wrong when the stakes are so high? But that desire for harmony is the beginning of decay. There's another mental trap, one we don't talk about enough. It's not the fear of being disliked. It's the obsession with being loved. Machiavelli noted that while it's tempting to rule with love, fear often keeps power more stable. But the real warning was deeper. When leaders tie their self-worth to being adored, they become vulnerable to something psychologists now call moral licensing. When you see yourself as a good person, as someone who's doing noble work, you give yourself permission to cut corners, just a little, just once, because you've earned it, because you're still doing more good than harm. And if people criticize you, they must be missing the bigger picture. They don't understand the sacrifices you've made. They don't see the good intentions behind your choices. The spiral begins when public image becomes more important than actual outcomes. Decisions are made not based on impact, but on optics. Problems are repackaged as progress. Mistakes are rebranded as growth, and slowly, without ever meaning to, a leader begins living in a world made of stories instead of facts. Once this transformation takes hold, it becomes incredibly hard to reverse. Because at that point, criticism isn't just inconvenient, it feels like betrayal. It threatens the very identity the leader has built for themselves. If they are fundamentally good, then those who question them must be misguided, or malicious, or worse. This is why once respected figures lash out at dissent, not because they're evil, but because they believe they're under attack. Their moral mission becomes sacred. Their detractors become enemies of virtue itself. This pattern played out in the life of Lance Armstrong. Once celebrated as a symbol of perseverance and triumph, his image was built on resilience, courage, and victory. When accusations of doping surfaced, he didn't just deny them. He targeted the accusers, destroyed reputations, ruined lives. Why? Because he wasn't just protecting medals. He was protecting a symbol, a narrative, an idea of himself that millions believed in and that he couldn't live without. When being seen as righteous matters more than actually doing right, ethics fade. Slowly, then completely. It starts with a lie told to protect others, then a truth left unsaid to protect yourself. Eventually, the entire operating system becomes about appearances over substance. That's just the beginning. I'll continue with the second half in the next message, maintaining the same tone and depth, and ensuring another 2,300 words of completely original, non-repetitive narration. Shall I proceed? There's another layer to this spiral, one that's more elusive, more dangerous, and almost always overlooked until it's too late. It lies in how those in power begin to interpret randomness, or what some would call fate. The belief that they alone are guiding every outcome, pulling every string, that coincidence bows before them simply because they've been right before. Machiavelli hinted at this when he described fortune as the master of half our actions, with the other half left to our own will. But many leaders, drunk on earlier success, forget that crucial division. This illusion of control can take root in even the most brilliant minds. The brain starts to edit the past. Every victory becomes a confirmation of genius, every loss an external sabotage. The danger isn't arrogance alone. It's a distortion in how cause and effect are perceived. Leaders begin to think success is the natural consequence of their decisions, never of luck, timing, or the unseen hands that shape all human endeavors. Over time, this misperception becomes a creed. It encourages recklessness, cloaked as boldness. It silences caution, rebranding it as cowardice. It turns any prudent warning into an obstacle to be bulldozed. After all, if you believe your judgment is flawless, then any advice suggesting limits must be short-sighted. And here's the most insidious twist. The illusion often sustains itself for a while. Confidence attracts resources. Resources produce momentum. Momentum generates results, at least temporarily. Even flawed strategies can produce short-term gains if enough people believe in them. This feedback reinforces the delusion. Doubters get pushed out. Supporters rise through the ranks. And suddenly, the entire system is running on faith in a single person's instincts. Psychologists call this phenomenon escalation of commitment. A leader invests in a failing course of action, not because they're unaware it's failing, but because abandoning it would be too painful. It would mean admitting the initial decision was wrong, and for someone whose entire identity is wrapped in being right, that kind of honesty feels like annihilation. Look at how this mindset gripped figures like Elon Musk. His early success stories rewrote the rules of possibility. He defied industries. He redefined ambition. But with that triumph came a growing belief that his intuition outmatched any conventional wisdom. Warnings from seasoned professionals were dismissed not because they lacked merit, but because they didn't match his vision. And when the world responded to his confidence with adoration, that belief calcified. This isn't to vilify, it's to understand. Because what begins as brilliance when isolated can mutate into blindness. As these distortions stack, delusions about morality, about randomness, about dissent, a final shift begins, a dangerous one. The leader who once inspired with vision starts to see any disagreement as a threat to the mission. Criticism stops being feedback, it starts being sabotage. Machiavelli understood this chilling turn with unnerving clarity. He noted that some wounds are better left unhealed, because a minor insult may provoke revenge, but a devastating blow leaves no room for retaliation. This wasn't a call to brutality. It was a warning about what happens when a ruler starts seeing the world as hostile by default. Modern psychology calls this hostile attribution bias. It's the tendency to assume others' ambiguous actions are driven by malice. A neutral glance becomes defiance. A quiet remark becomes conspiracy. The more isolated a leader becomes, the more this bias flourishes. When no one around you tells the truth, every outside voice begins to sound like an enemy. This paranoia isn't always born from insecurity. It often stems from the erosion of meaningful relationships. When everyone close to you is paid to agree, when admiration is bought rather than earned, the concept of authentic connection fades. You don't know who's honest anymore, so you trust no one at all. This was the path that consumed Joseph Stalin. He didn't start out as a monster. He began as a man of ideology, someone who believed in change. But the corridors of power dimmed his vision. Every disagreement looked like betrayal. Every policy critique hinted at treason. So he silenced them, one by one, until the silence became absolute. And the horror is this. From the inside, it all feels necessary. Not cruel, not despotic, necessary. A means of protecting the greater mission from those who don't understand, those who mean well but are misguided. The language shifts, but the outcome stays the same. Dissent vanishes, and the echo chamber becomes complete. Today, we live in an era where these traps are no longer confined to royal courts or political offices. Technology has given every powerful person the tools to construct their own universe. With algorithms, with publicists, with selective access to platforms, they can flood their surroundings with voices that say, "You're right." They don't get it. Keep going. And they do. Right over the cliff. Machiavelli warned that most people judge by appearances, not by truth. Today, appearances aren't just part of power. They are power. A polished feed, a trending quote, a branded persona. In the digital realm, visibility becomes credibility. Style becomes substance. When leaders curate their own reality so effectively, they stop needing to confront friction. They don't have to answer hard questions or adjust to failure. They can live in a carefully filtered loop where their reflection is always flattering. And once you begin believing your own mirror, truth becomes irrelevant. Consider how many tech giants have positioned themselves as humanity's saviors. They speak of disruption, of democratizing access, of making the world better. Yet many of the platforms they've built exploit attention, addict users, and hollow out real connection. Still, they remain convinced of their nobility. Why? Because they consume articles that call them visionaries. They attend panels where their critics are absent. They've outsourced their conscience to applause. And it's not just them. This is a cultural epidemic, a structural design flaw. The systems we've built reward confidence more than competence, performance more than prudence, narrative more than nuance. So, what's the way forward? If power naturally leads towards self-deception, how do we prevent the descent? The answer isn't to renounce power. The world needs leadership, desperately. The real solution lies in designing structures that resist delusion. Some of history's most grounded leaders did something radical. They made dissent a part of the architecture. Abraham Lincoln famously appointed rivals to his cabinet, people who had publicly criticized him, who had every reason to challenge him. Not because he liked disagreement, but because he understood its value. He knew that unchecked consensus is the enemy of wisdom. Franklin D. Roosevelt embraced what some called strategic chaos. He allowed overlapping roles, encouraged argument, and made space for disagreement. It wasn't dysfunction, it was design. Because disagreement, when structured properly, isn't a threat to leadership. It's its lifeline. In the business world, Ray Dalio created an entire culture around what he called radical transparency. At Bridgewater, no one is immune to challenge. Interns can critique CEOs. Mistakes are logged, not hidden. And while the system isn't perfect, it points to a deeper truth. The only way to resist the psychological traps of power is to build in mechanisms that constantly challenge your reality. But that only works if the person at the top truly wants it to. If a leader punishes honesty and rewards flattery, no system can save them. The desire to be told the truth must be greater than the desire to be adored. And that's a rare kind of self-discipline. It requires accepting embarrassment, owning mistakes, admitting ignorance. It means waking up every day knowing that someone might point out where you failed and thanking them for it. Because in the long run, it's that discomfort that protects you from collapse. And the responsibility doesn't fall on leaders alone. Every person in the orbit of power, employees, voters, journalists, family, has a role to play. Flattery isn't kindness. Silence isn't loyalty. Enabling delusion is its own kind of cruelty. If you care about the mission, about the organization, about the future, you speak up. The most dangerous people aren't the ones who set out to do harm. They're the ones who believe with all their heart that they're doing good and are no longer capable of hearing otherwise. They've lost the ability to ask, "What if I'm wrong?" Our job isn't just to judge them. It's to ensure the systems around them are strong enough to prevent the fall. To build cultures where telling the truth is rewarded, where failure is examined rather than hidden, where ego doesn't choke out wisdom. Machiavelli didn't write for villains. He wrote for realists, for people who understand that leadership isn't a storybook, and power isn't magic. It's pressure, it's distortion, it's risk. And if we forget that, if we treat power as a blessing rather than a burden, we invite disaster. Because in the end, every protector can become a predator, every savior can become a tyrant, and every idealist, without warning, can become the very thing they once vowed to destroy. The only antidote is vigilance, not just of systems and laws, but of the human mind. And the only hope is humility, the kind that can withstand success, the kind that listens when no one else dares speak, the kind that keeps the mirror just clear enough to reflect the truth. That's what Machiavelli saw centuries ago, and that's what we must see now more than ever.